Well, I can see that our years of bringing you here to essentially PAP presentations has actually destroyed your confidence in the government completely. And I promise that I won't give your email addresses to my revenue friends. Now, on to the real part. Because here we have, let me introduce Renate Samson, who is the Chief Executive Officer of Big Brother Watch. And since 2009, Big Brother Watch has been watching, starting with the Labour government and then the coalition government and now the present Conservative government, on how they deal with the issue of data and privacy. And as you can guess, they have about as much confidence in the governments as you have shown. Very little. But on the other hand, it does require in-depth investigation. And Renate has been doing that in-depth investigation. Now let me tell you something about Renate. Renate tells me that in fact she started off as an actress. I'm not sure where I'd put that. On the other hand, like you, she has fears about your data, our personal privacy. And slowly but surely, she's been drawn into this world of investigating the inquiries, the in-depth investigations, the invasions of your privacy. And as I said before, Big Brother Watch specializes in this, and Renate has now become the Chief Executive and speaks directly to Parliament and to government. Please welcome Renate Samson.
Thank you very much. I might, after that, I might just sit down because I think you could probably teach me a few things about where this should be pitched. But I'm enormously reassured, and if we run it at the end, I really hope I don't turn you the opposite way. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I feel as though I'm in a lovely space, very comfortable people. But what I'm going to talk about is about current legislation, mainly about the Investigatory Powers Bill. So first of all, I'm going to have us consider, and actually you've already given me the answers, but work with me anyway, this idea of our respect for spies that we have in this country. I can see that we're not very reassured with the state of the government, but we do have a respect for spies. We praise them. We see them as the good men and women of Bletchley who helped us win the Second World War. And that's absolutely right. They did. And spies and spying is entertainment. You know, we've got James Bond, we've got Spooks, the spy who came in from the cold, and anybody who's been glued to the television on a Sunday night has probably been watching The Night Porter rather. Spying has a certain elegance to it. And in fact, it's attractive, it's glamorous, it's something that we glorify. But I'm not actually that sure whether or not it's healthy for us to glorify a trade which increasingly is focused on spying on us. It's increasingly focused on restricting our liberty, and indeed it chips away at our privacy. I think we've got a problem in this country that we glorify James Bond when really we should be looking a little bit more to our neighbours over in Europe who know that spying is a bit more Stasi-like than James Bond-like, and therefore question whether or not spies are actually doing the job that we would want them to do, or whether they are actually impinging on our civil liberties. I don't really want to sound very melodramatic about that. Maybe the tone of my voice doesn't sound that melodramatic despite my drama degree. But these are questions that we don't really ask ourselves. Do we actually sit and think what it would be like to live in a state that was run by the Stasi? And maybe what we've got coming up is closer to that than we realise. We absolutely, most of us, live by the belief that if we've got nothing to hide, then we absolutely have nothing to fear. But I think that concept of nothing to hide, nothing to fear is increasingly becoming out of date. And the Investigatory Powers Bill, which is currently making its way through Parliament and had its second reading a fortnight ago, is one of these things that I think will challenge that idea. The Investigatory Powers Bill was warmly welcomed, as you would imagine, by Conservative MPs. I have to say, I find that very dispiriting. Conservatism, obviously, historically, was the idea of a small state rather than a big state spying on everything we do. And if you actually go back to a 1929 Conservative manifesto brochure, there's a picture of lots of big nose poking into our home, telling us that we shouldn't allow the socialists to poke around our castles. So castles not because they're conservatives, but your home being your castle. So I sort of feel dispirited, but not surprised that the Conservatives are supporting this bill so wholeheartedly. I'm not surprised that Labour seem completely unsure about which bits of the bill they agree with. And the reality is most of them agree with a lot of it. Not all of them. Some of them do oppose it, but I think we're going to struggle to have the Labour Party oppose the bill in the way that we really want. But none of us should be surprised that the Liberal Democrats and indeed the SNP are really chewing their fingers off it with anger about how this bill has worked out. And that's great. There's just not enough of them to help us out, really. So the bill, whether we like it or not, will, by the end of this year, be law. In some form or another. It'll become law just at the point that we actually will be living in a world that will be spent with even more of our lives online. Because the world that we know right now of the internet is fast disappearing. What we've got coming is the Internet of Things, where everything, and I mean everything, will be connected to the online world all the time. To access even the most very basic of services, we will need to have a digital profile. We will, by the end of the decade, I think, be considered total digital citizens. We will live our lives connected, our devices will be connected, and every single thing we do will be monitored. And with each of these new services and new approaches, the data that we will be giving these devices will be pumped out and, under this bill, made available to the government, the police, and the intelligence agencies. But before I explore with you exactly what that's going to mean to us, I thought it might be helpful to have a bit of a history check on how we've got to this stage and what modern surveillance law in this country has all been about. And what's ironic about this is we need to start back in 1984, when the Telecommunications Act became law. The Telecommunications Act was primarily an act to privatise British Telecom and to establish Ofcom. But in the background of it, it gave the government the opportunity to instruct a telecommunications service such as BT to assist them in matters of national security by tapping our phones. This quiet little measure wasn't actually anything to do with government. It was to allow the intelligence agencies to access our communications. But the reason it was so quiet and hidden away in this much bigger bill, the reason it was so secret, is that to all intents and purposes, the intelligence agencies didn't actually exist. No one knew about MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. It didn't actually take until 1989, 5 years later, for MI5, the intelligence agency, which, as you all know, deals with surveillance of the UK, that's when they became publicly known about, publicly acknowledged. It was another 5 years from that that we learned of the existence of MI6, who deal with international surveillance, and of GCHQ, the government's communications headquarters, which was Bletchley, and is now this enormous donut of spies donut because of the shape of the building, of spies based in Cheltenham. And they are, whether we like it or not, involved in all aspects of spying, surveillance, and security in this country, involved in a lot of government departments and government IT projects. So we can't escape them. This process, though, of the agencies coming out of the darkness and into the light meant that their work had to be acknowledged. And one of the laws that did this was RIPA, the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which came into force in 2000. RIPA created a set of rules for the agencies, police, government bodies, and councils to enable them to conduct a variety of surveillance against people, but also for them to legally acquire and hold our communications data. Data which companies held for business purposes. So the sort of thing that you would expect to see on a phone bill, the who you called, when you called them, and where the call took place. RIPA was and is hugely important, but it was and is hugely complicated, and it's mostly incomprehensible, even to the people who drafted it. And not only that, it was pretty much out of date before the ink had even dried on it. Because Ripper was written for a world where the internet was still an information superhighway, if you remember that term from Tomorrow's World. That's what the internet was back in 2000. It wasn't this magical digital playground that we know and love and can't avoid today. Within 4 years of Ripper becoming law, Google had fundamentally changed how we navigated the internet. Facebook had turned it from a public research space to a space where we shared absolutely everything with friends and family all around the world. And Amazon had changed the way that we shopped, making online much more convenient than the high street. Mobile phones had become less about making telephone calls and more about texting, emailing, using social media, taking photos of your lunch, whatever. Very few of us actually make a call on a mobile phone now. In fact, the phone is less of a phone. It's now like a little mini computer in our pockets because it holds every single aspect of our lives in its grip. So the ways in which we were communicating by the time that Ripper came out had completely changed, and Ripper couldn't cope. And with all of these changes to the way that we were communicating, the spies started to freak out. They started to claim that they were going dark, that they couldn't see our communications. They claimed that they were still able to listen in, but they couldn't see how we text, how we emailed, and what we were doing online. And they were grumbling about it. And they were grumbling loudly about it. But rather than go back and rewrite this incomprehensible piece of legislation and make it fit for the time that it was needed, the government just fiddled around the edges. Consecutive governments have fiddled around the edges, and they've all attempted to create a wide variety of new laws to deal with the problems of not having access to this data. The most well-known of this was the draft Communications Data Bill, which all of us in this room will probably know of as the Snoopers Charter. The Snoopers Charter was an attempt by the coalition government of all governments to deal with this going dark claim that the Home Office said the spooks were struggling with. They were calling it a capability gap. But it didn't actually exist. Because the intention with the Snoopers Charter was to get every single telephone or internet provider to retain our internet browsing history, that's everything we do online, our telephone calls, our emails, our text messages, and even online gaming. They wanted it to be held for 12 months. This data is over and above the information that any of these companies need to provide us with a service. It's data which is completely personal to us. It reveals how we live our lives in ways that most of us aren't really aware of. Everything we search for on Google is very intrusive. We often type into Google what our inner thought process is saying, rather than just, where's the nearest chip shop? We might type in, what's this lump? How do I find a divorce lawyer? How do I kill my husband? So because of that, this draft bill was hugely criticised, not just by privacy campaigners. Indeed, a joint committee of peers and MPs were convened to scrutinise it, and they found that it had gone way too far. It was far too intrusive. It made recommendations that were out of the ordinary, and they proposed that should the government ever wish to do this, proper safeguards should be implemented, and there should be an absolute restriction on the amount of data any government could acquire on any of us. Because of that report, and because of the very vocal support of that report from the then Deputy Prime Minister Nick Clegg, the Snoopers Charter was, thankfully, booted into the long grass. The Home Office went back to their desks with their tail between their legs and complaining the whole time that the agencies and the police weren't going to be able to look after us properly. But then Edward Snowden happened. And we learned from his revelations that all this stuff about going dark and capability gaps was, as I say, absolute nonsense. Because the intelligence agencies here and in America have been conducting mass surveillance of us all along. They have been tapping the internet cables that run off the coast of Cornwall and which carry all of the world's internet activity in it. And they've been using the 1984 Telecommunications Act to spy on each and every one of our phone calls post 9/11. The claims, therefore, as I say, of them going dark were blown out of the water because they weren't going dark. Not legally. So the world was momentarily shocked and everyone freaked out about Snowden and everybody demanded answers. And it was time that the intelligence agencies explained themselves. And in America, they did. They absolutely acknowledged that some of what Snowden had revealed had been happening. And they began to take proper action to roll back on the powers and ensure that they were restricted so that the general law-abiding public felt safe from reckless surveillance. But in the UK, our government and the intelligence agencies kept stum. They neither confirmed nor denied the claims. A year later, in 2014, a legal judgment came down from the Court of Justice of the European Union, which upset the equilibrium once again. An organisation similar to Big Brother Watch, called Digital Rights Ireland, had brought a case which questioned whether the 12-month retention in bulk of our communications data, this who, where, when, what, how, irrespective of suspicion of any crime, whether it breached our right to a private life as defined by Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. The judges in the Court of Europe determined yes, it did. It was a breach. That data should only be retained under request if there is a specific crime that needs to be investigated. Companies should not be forced to hold such personal data for a year just on the off chance that the police or the intelligence agencies might need it further down the line. And overnight, it became illegal for any European member state to hold this data. Germany, Austria, Slovakia, and a few other EU countries all abided by the rule. The UK, once again, did nothing. In fact, it took our government 3 months to do something about it. 3 months to react. And when they did react, rather than being logical about this and calm about it, they presented an emergency piece of legislation to Parliament, a bill called DRIPA, the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act. This emergency legislation was given 1 day's debate in the House of Commons, and it was passed in 3 days. It was made law within 3 days. The usual process takes at least a year. So rather than have a proper public debate, they issued it in a rush. They told all the members of Parliament that it was to do with terrorism. They all freaked out. They didn't have the time to read the massive bill, and they just made it law. The entire debacle was met with absolutely savage criticism. But there was one saving grace in DRIPA, and that's that it expires. It expires at the end of this year. So at the end of this year, they won't legally be allowed to retain this data, unless, of course, they pass another bill before then. And that's what they're trying to do. So that's the Investigatory Powers Bill, where we find ourselves at now. Now, I know that you're going to be debating this again tomorrow morning, so you know a little bit about it. But just as a recap, it was published in November of last year as a draft bill, and it was launched to great fanfare by the Home Secretary, Theresa May, who said, and I quote, that it would be a world leader and would provide some of the strongest protections and safeguards anywhere in the democratic world. It will set new standards for openness, transparency, and oversight. While some of that is slightly right, they are rather highfalutin statements for sure, and they have been criticised, left, right, and centre, and not just by people like me, but by 3 parliamentary committees. The Science and Technology Committee, the Intelligence and Security Committee, and a joint committee convened solely to look at the bill, have all scrutinised it for a few weeks. Not a few months, sadly, but for a few weeks. And they all published their reports at the beginning of February. All 3 of them, without any exceptions, heavily criticised the draft proposals. They criticised the lack of clarity, the lack of detail, and the lack of any technical comprehension in the bill. They queried, indeed, how the proposals would even work, and they raised concern that the Home Office's attempts to speculate on what the fee of all of this would be were pretty wide off the mark. The Science and Technology Committee were very concerned about potential unintended consequences that they felt the bill would have on business and commerce in the UK. They were very clear that in addressing the issues of national security, we might actually be putting ourselves at greater risk, and that we might actually damage the economic well-being of the country because of all the demands that this bill is going to place on UK IT, an area that is growing, it's growing substantially, and it should be the future of what this country is about. The Intelligence and Security Committee, who were tasked specifically to look at the work of the intelligence agencies, they attacked the inconsistency and the broadness of the bill, particularly of the bulk proposals in it, which I'll come to shortly. They pointed out that government, and I can't really believe this, government didn't even know what the operational case for much of these powers would be. And surprisingly, they also pointed out that they felt a committee that are completely on the side of what the government do and what the intelligence agencies do, they felt that privacy was lacking, that privacy should be made the backbone of this bill. Never thought I'd agree with the Intelligence and Security Committee, a committee that put me front page of the Times newspaper last year saying I was a friend of terrorists because of my views. But they're right, privacy should be made the backbone of this bill. Finally, the Joint Committee, the ones chosen specifically to assess the bill in all of its detail, they made 86 recommendations. Their language wasn't quite as strong as the other committees, but 86 recommendations. That's a vast number of what was needed to make this bill fit for the purpose that it's required for. Now, off the back of all of that, you would imagine that the Home Office would think, crikey, we've got an awful lot of work to do. We better go away and properly think this through. But they didn't. Of course they didn't. 3 weeks after the final of the reports, they produced a 245-page bill and almost 700 pages of supporting documentation, with 2 weeks to read it before it was then debated in the House for a second time. Very few of the recommendations made by their peers in the House were adopted. In fact, the Home Office's attempts to make privacy the backbone of the bill involved nothing more than adding the word privacy into the opening chapter's title. So what was general safeguards is now general privacy safeguards, and there's not one other change in that chapter. So the calls for clarity completely fell on deaf ears. The calls for privacy fell on deaf ears, and the operational cases that the Intelligence and Security Committee felt that they didn't have. Well, I've read them, and they just look like they're sort of fantasy ideas that have been cut and pasted from other things and bunged into a document called the operational case. So what is this bill? What is it? What's being proposed? It is enormous. I'm not going to go through all of it, so don't worry. But what I'm going to do is give you a rundown of what I think are some of the key problems. For the first time, this bill will make it lawful for the intelligence agencies to gather internet and phone data on international and UK citizens. It will be lawful for both the intelligence agencies and the police to hack our phones, computers, smart TVs, games consoles, in fact, anything that's got a microphone or a camera. All of that can be hacked without us knowing. It will be lawful for the government to insist that companies we engage with, decrypt our encrypted communications on demand, and that companies will be served notices requiring them to build systems solely for the collection and retention of communications of their customers. This will include the new power of Internet Connection Records. Internet Connection Records, also known as ICRs, will require that all Internet and app activity from our mobile phones is held for a year. This will reveal every website we've logged into, they will make it available to the police, to the taxman, to your local council, and to the NHS if they request it. Even the Gambling Commission will be able to access this data. Now, I think it all sounds a bit intrusive. I would, wouldn't I? But when you put it all into the context of keeping us safe, as the Home Office will do, protecting us from terrorists, protecting our children from paedophiles, protecting us from serious crime, well, then it all sounds perfectly fine. It's all perfectly harmless, particularly when we're told that the safeguards will be world-leading and that they'll be there to ensure that only the bad people are surveyed, targeted, and hacked. These safeguards will, according to the government, ensure that no British person's data will be looked at unless there is a specific warrant, that the police will only use this data when there's a specific reason to use it, and that the intelligence agencies will only hack or collect in bulk when it's deemed necessary and proportionate for them to do so, and when a Secretary of State authorises it, and a judge, in the form of a judicial commissioner, reviews their decision and then approves it. When it's put like that, it's all jolly reasonable and terribly sensible, and it's good to go. Only, of course, it's not as it seems, because these things never are. So let's unpick it all and look closely at how it's going to impact on our privacy and possibly, more importantly, you could argue, on our security, thereby failing us all. First of all, let's understand what the government mean by bulk. Bulk, as you and I know it, means everything, and that's what the government mean. Bulk interception means that all the data flowing through those internet cables under the coast of Cornwall that carry the world's internet data, they will all be tapped, and every bit of data in that tap will be grabbed and held and stored. The same for bulk hacking. It will mean that all devices relating to a group, country, or company can be hacked by dropping viruses into the system, or, as I described, turning on and off microphones and cameras. The bill defines bulk as useful when they don't know what it is that they're looking for. So that's neither necessary or proportionate by most of our definitions. Bulk, you see, as we all know, is a method of mass surveillance in order to try and find a plot, not to investigate an action that's already happening. It's the needle in the haystack search, and we will all be the haystack. But as I say, there is a safeguard, and that safeguard is that we'll only be spied on if the government find us through a filter of the data that they're using. Now, they say that this filter will be made up of keywords, only they don't tell us how many keywords. And according to the Snowden files, there are tens of thousands of keywords, which will broaden the filter from this to this, obviously. We're told that it will be used like a Google search. So you type in Renate Samson on a train from London to Birmingham to come and speak to a bunch of Unitarians. I'm found then. But because of that broadness, they then said, well, no, don't worry. If you're a UK citizen like me, then we won't be looking at you. We'll only look at you if you think you're up to something. But as soon as it's flagged to us that you're a UK citizen, then we need to go and get another warrant to do that. Oh, sounds marvellous. Apart from I use a .com email address, and that would imply that I live in America. I don't use a .co.uk email address. And how would they know that I'm a UK citizen until they've actually looked at the data to determine that I'm a Brit? And then go, oh, crikey, quick, I need another warrant to carry on reading this stuff. I'm not entirely sure that that's as safe as they imply, but obviously I don't know. Bulk hacking, that's an entirely different kettle of fish. How can any of us be kept safe when any company that we might engage with has a hack going on from GCHQ? It might sound completely ridiculous that GCHQ could hack an entire company's database or technology, but it's already been done, and it's been done a number of times, and I'm going to give you one example that came from the Snowden revelations. Between 2008 and 2011, a scheme called Optic Nerve was used by GCHQ here and the NSA in America. This was a way that GCHQ hacked the webcams of people who have Yahoo internet accounts. Anybody who had a webcam and was using it through a Yahoo address was hacked. Over just 6 months of that time frame, 1.8 million people around the world were photographed every single 5 minutes chatting online to their friends or to their family. Innocent people going about their private business, sat at work, at home, in bed, chatting to friends, family, loved ones on what they thought was a private call. All of them were being watched by GCHQ because GCHQ had got wind that some bad people were using Yahoo. Interestingly, and you could say obviously, most of what they discovered was data that was completely worthless. Because rather than being flooded with videos of terrorists chatting online about plotting attacks, many of the images showed, and I quote GCHQ, a surprising number of people use webcam conversations to show intimate parts of their body to the other person. I don't know about you, but I'm not entirely surprised by that, and I'm kind of surprised that GCHQ was surprised. Because what we do in our private time is private. But in an attempt to catch the bad guys, our trusted spies surveyed everybody. So any suggestion, therefore, that UK citizens will only be looked at when linked with a specific case, or when a further warrant has been obtained, might not be quite as accurate as we may hope. Now, If we manage to slip through all of this, if we don't have a mobile telephone and we're not connected to anything and we're not using the internet, you're still not safe. Because there's a thing called a bulk personal data set. Of all the things in this bill which show that we are all a suspect in the eyes of the intelligence agencies, bulk personal data sets are the one. The Home Office have offered very, very, very little information to anyone that has asked about what they are. All they've done is they've indicated that they may contain details of both the living and the dead, and that they will contain details about people who are, and again I quote, not of security or intelligence interest. So, it appears that by simply being born in the UK, you will be on a data set that will have a secondary purpose to the one that you assume it has. Your birth certificate, your national insurance number, your driver's license, your passport, your health records, even the fact that you're a member of the Unitarians, may all be held for surveillance purposes. But that's not all. Passenger lists for flights, for trains, for ferries, attendees of sporting events, people at different places of worship, indicators of where we shop, if we're subscribed to a magazine or not. All of that can be requested as a data set, monitored for strange behaviour. So whatever we do, wherever we go, even if we're not online, will be held on a data set held by the intelligence agencies and used to join the dots about people that they think might be up to no good. I think that's a step too far. So that's all the bulk stuff. What about the targeted stuff? Surely targeted is going to be a whole lot better than the bulk stuff, right? Because you and I both think of targeted, I would imagine, as being one person, one place, one phone. But that's not what the government think of targeted as. The government's definition of targeted means a group of people, an area of places. An area, a group, a collection of mobile telephones, a system of computers. None of that's very targeted to me. That's the same as bulk. So no matter what we do, even if we do nothing but simply breathe, we are potentially caught up in surveillance. How do we go about protecting ourselves then? What about encryption? Because that's what we're all being told, even by the government, that we should be using to protect our data. Because they're not going to mess with stuff that they're actively promoting, are they? Yes, of course they are. Because despite the fact that encryption is increasingly necessary for us to protect ourselves from hackers, online criminals, and identity theft, which is costing the country vast sums of money, the government have made it a requirement in the IP bill to insist that a company, any company with over 10,000 users, which is most internet companies now, on receipt of a warrant are to hand over encrypted data in a readable format. I should be clear, that's any UK company. Now, whilst this seems logical as a way of only accessing the data of a criminal, as the recent Apple FBI row has shown, what it's also shown is that companies aren't always going to do what they're told, because the request to decrypt our data will potentially make us all very, very vulnerable. It will create backdoors into systems or create weaknesses in systems that won't just deal with the criminal, it will deal with all of us. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, stated in a letter when he was ordered to do this by the FBI that he found these requests, the implications of these demands, to be chilling. Because, and again I quote, the government could extend this breach of privacy and demand that Apple build surveillance software to intercept your messages, access your health records or financial data, track your location, or even access your phone's microphone or camera without your knowledge. So we find ourselves in a moral dilemma. How do we keep ourselves safe online if systems are to be weakened? How do companies who hold all of our personal data protect us when the government demand access? Indeed, should companies do as governments order them? Should they act as an extension of the state? Or should they protect the rights, freedoms and privacy of their customers? Or is it even their decision to make? Maybe the emphasis should be on us as individuals. Maybe it should be down to us to hand over our phones and say, here's the encryption key, or face going to prison. Or maybe governments should accept that just as in the the physical, analog, non-digital world, some evidence relating to a crime is simply not accessible. I think this is the debate of our times, because everyone uses the internet. Everyone, as we've pointed out, both good and bad, uses the internet. And to watch the bad guys means to watch us all. Now, of course, you're going to think, I would say all of this. I'm a privacy campaigner. I'm full of fear, and it's all terrible. It's all apocalyptic. It's all privacy unfriendly. La, 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 la. Only for the first time, it's not just privacy campaigners saying this. In fact, of the draft bill, hundreds of submissions, both oral and written, were given to the committees scrutinising it. Lawyers, technical experts, big business, startups, members of parliament, journalists, members of the public, and privacy campaigners all raised concerns, all said that so many elements of this bill just simply won't work. But still the government ploughs on. And it's such a shame, because this is a bill that's needed. I don't query that. We need this bill. But it's a bill that's wasted. We are wasting a golden opportunity to make a law which will be fit and proper for the world to come, not the world today. And this is a really critical point. What the proposals are fit for the world that we have now, where we log in online. It's not fit for what's coming down the road, because the future of security and of privacy is under threat by what's going to happen with the internet. I suspect that the online world won't be recognisable, as I said, by the end of the decade, but at least within the next 10 years. It will bring profound challenges that we haven't really considered. Because with the Internet of Things, which I mentioned, the idea of everything being connected everywhere all the time, we will live the Internet. It will be around us. We will actually have it interwoven into us. We will have wearables on us. Everything we do, every aspect of our home, of our cars, of our work, of our life, will be connected. And it will be digitized. We will effectively be digital citizens. So at that point, our understanding of what it means to be secure will completely change. Because the threats that this bill are addressing will all be played out online. It's not just going to be real-life terrorism, paedophilia, criminal acts. These acts are going to become cyber terrorists, cyber hacking, cyber. So the concept then of the proposals in the bill being that they're going to protect us by hacking us, by surveying us, by monitoring all of our online activity, I think that that's completely balmy. I think that's going to make us more vulnerable. And it won't just be an infringement of our civil liberties. It will be an actual weakness of the way we live our lives, full stop. These proposals won't guarantee safety or security for any of us. Encryption will. Encryption won't be a choice. It will be a necessity. And companies or organisations who weaken it simply won't be trusted. So this bill's idea that they're going to make every UK IT company create a back door so that they can monitor what we're doing, no one is going to want to engage with a UK company. We will want to see businesses being more like Apple and less like TalkTalk, who took no security over their customers' data in any way, shape or form. And customers that don't look after us, we will leave, as I say. Because all of us, even those who, as I mentioned at the start, think we've got nothing to hide, nothing to fear online, will start to consider safety and privacy as paramount. Because, as we heard last week, the head of the Metropolitan Police, Bernard Hogan-Howe, said that if you are hacked and you lose any money from your bank account, if you didn't take measures to secure yourself, then you shouldn't be reimbursed. And there was outrage. But that's already what we've got. If you're burgled and you've left the back door open or all the windows unlocked, no insurance company is going to help you out. And let's be honest, we all lock the doors to our homes when we leave because we all have something to hide and we all fear the burglar trying to find that stuff. So the more we hear about having to look after ourselves, the more there is a push to us taking responsibility for ourselves, the more we're going to want to have a law that doesn't make us vulnerable. And this bill, as I say, long-term will impact both our privacy and our security. Benjamin Franklin, key friend of the privacy campaigner for some marvellous quotes, said that there are two certainties in life, death and taxes. I think we're staring down the barrel of a third, and that's surveillance. And I don't think that surveillance has to be the third certainty in life. Because if we stop seeing privacy and security as two separate things and bring them together, stop having conversations that are led by the government telling us we have to give up our privacy for our security, then I think we can live in a kinder, safer, and more balanced world. So please join me tomorrow, if you can, support the motion as is going to be discussed. And if you can engage with the Home Office, with your local MP, the local newspaper, with your local groups, to raise concern that this bill is needed but isn't the bill that we should have, that it needs an awful lot of work, then hopefully we can try and change the government's approach, and we can get a bill by the end of the year that will keep us safe and private. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening.